Do you remember back in the, early 2010s when social media was kind of considered this like raw representation of all of our brains and hearts, right? Like there was this moment coming out of the Arab Spring, right, which Facebook got all this credit for having helped make possible, where we were sort of thinking of it, academics and journalists like myself included, as a place where you could really sort of measure raw sentiment. And that innocent idea led, it turns out, to an incredibly naive period where we were not prepared for the ways in which, political trolls and eventually whole country-sized actors came on to these platforms and began to manipulate all of us. The person I'm interviewing today was really out in front of this. Renee DiResta is now an associate professor at Georgetown. She also helped to run something called the Stanford Cyber Observatory, the Internet Observatory, Stanford Internet Observatory. Amazing work she has done over the years. But she started out as a quantitative trader on Wall Street. And then right after, as she tells the story, you'll hear in a moment, right after she had children, she got drawn into all of the weird anti-vax stuff that she was seeing on social media. And from there became basically like a national resource in understanding how we all get manipulated online. She's testified before Congress. She's done breakthrough research on how, for instance, Russia used these sorts of manipulative tactics on social media for the 2016 election. And now she's written a book called Invisible Rulers about the ways in which we all get pulled to and fro. She is the perfect person to speak to when it comes to the rip current, because as you know, I'm trying to articulate here these big invisible forces that are pulling at us and doing, really taking us far from where we started without us even really realizing. All of that is why I had Renee on here. She's a longtime intellectual hero of mine, and I really hope you enjoyed this hour-long conversation with Renee DiResta. Renee DiResta, thank you so much for being on the Rip Current.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with, should we do the book? Should we do the early days? I don't know. I mean, you and for anyone who I just feel like it's important to point out, right? There's a symbiotic relationship between academic researchers like yourself and journalists like myself, in that there's a sort of orbit that we occupy sort of together. I would argue that you are doing us a favor in sharing what you do with us, but there is kind of a relationship. I wonder, maybe we could just start with a little bit of you've done all this research, you've done all this testimony, you've done all this writing, but there is there's kind of a community, it feels to me, of people who know what you know, but who haven't decided to just put it to work, to make money, but, and seem to feel some obligation to do something responsible with what you've learned. Can we understand a little bit about the DNA that makes that possible for you? Like, why do you do this? Why don't you just hand what you know to the big companies?
Well, I'm interested in understanding adversarial abuse. So my work has focused not so much just on influencer dynamics and how influencers make money, or how influencers make stories go viral, or just content creators. There's a lot of great journalists who focus on content creators writ large. Taylor Lorenz, for example, has written about people who, just make dance stories trends and things like that. And,
Right.
the sort of novel celebrity components or culture components. And that's not to diminish it. That's really interesting stuff related to how we form public opinion about culture and celebrity stories and things like this. But I tend to focus a little bit more on the intersection with the explicitly manipulative. So for me, it would be pretty unethical to say hey, here are all the very evil things that you can do. Go out and do them. So I tend to think about my work as looking at the downsides. The same way you can use a hammer to build a house, or you can use it as a weapon. I tend to think about what I look at is the stuff that's bad, and highlighting the harms so that we can think about guardrails, whether that's policy, whether that's tech and design, whether that's moderation, just different ways that we can think about gating off or highlighting for purposes of raising awareness, those bad sides of social media and of the tools that we've been given.
You mentioned Taylor Lorenz. Our guest about 2 weeks ago was Kat Tenbarge.
Oh yeah, another excellent person who covers this
Right,
stuff.
and her take on how she thinks about this stuff, it reminds me very much of you in the book, which we'll talk about in just a second, in that she's really thinking about how these sort of influence campaigns that happen on behalf of celebrities, and what she told us about was that the campaigns and the processes and so forth, which look to the public as if it's just sort of the natural flow of celebrity, turns out to be this very, very, calculated for hire sort of system. And she thinks about that, as she says, sort of, that it's very much related to what you have looked at when it comes to Russian influence campaigns, state actors, and the rest of it. And now everything you're talking about in this book. It is interesting to me just how easily some people sort of dismiss this as, influencer stuff, when in fact it is so crucial, it feels to me, to the future of democracy. How do you think about that?
Well, so Kat's work, I've followed her coverage of things like Blake Lively and Jason Baldoni, right? And some of these areas where I pay very little attention to that aspect of it when it's just celebrity culture, but when it intersects with the manipulative, right? Where you have these character assassination campaigns where, for example, an actress is made to seem difficult, right? And in the case of Blake Lively, I'll be honest, I don't remember all of the specifics. I know there's a court case. There's I believe that, if I recall correctly, she filed a lawsuit related to, or she filed a complaint, I think, related to problems with some intimacy coordinator issues, feeling uncomfortable on set. She was then painted as extremely difficult, if I recall correctly. There was a he said, she said dynamic that was how it was framed in the public discourse around it. Right. Influencers who comment on celebrity culture kind of took sides. This was also, you see this kind of thing happening in some of the court cases, big high profile divorce cases. This happened with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, were then defamation cases that result in this, again, the character assassination dynamics that go along with. You're not only fighting the court case, you're fighting the battle for public opinion. So how is that battle for public opinion framed? Well, it's very much framed in how influencers who are talking about celebrity culture are shaping the discourse for the fandoms, that's very kind of parasocial relationships that people have to celebrities and that people have to the influencers that are talking about the celebrities now. So kind of multiple layers of this this opinion shaping process. The ways in which you start to see in the Blake Lively situation, what Ms. Lively's lawyers managed to get was evidence of a PR firm actively saying, we're going to torch her reputation in the following ways. And then you see some of those narratives, some of those, the kind of commentary actually reflected in the influencer commentary. You start to see the way in which this is not as organic as it seems. And so the commentary about Ms. Lively is actually, in fact, planted, if you will, sort of the sort of dark arts of PR to make her seem to be something she's not. This was, of course, I thought, rather selfishly, okay, now people are going to pay attention, because instead of it just being about politics, which is rather niche and something that not a lot of people pay attention to, which of course is where I spend almost all of my time, now that it's happening to a celebrity, you're going to start to see people wake up and realize how
surely
easy
America will come to its
is.
senses. Yeah.
Well, they'll realize, how much character assassination is such an integral part of how easy it can be actually to do, and the impact that it can have. And you do see, in fact, as that begins to happen, Kat covers it, and Taylor covers it, and some of these other journalists who really focus on kind of creator economy and influencer culture, covering these stories. And what they're doing is they're telling the story of what is a propaganda campaign, just that it's one that is dealing with influencer culture and celebrity and entertainment, as opposed to where I tend to cover it, which is much more in the realm of the political, of the policy, of advocacy. And the tactics are identical, the strategies are identical. But I think when people see it play out in a realm that they find more accessible, it kind of opens their mind. They can follow it because they saw that story play out in their Instagram feed, in their TikTok, in a way that they might not have on the political front. So I really appreciate that intersection.
Totally. The Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni thing also, I feel like, is such an interesting experiment, because a lot of people, including myself, can then experiment with their, can evaluate their own feelings on it. Like, how did
Right.
I feel about Blake Lively? Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if I got, if I was getting played in the same way. So
Right.
this gets us to the book, right? So the book is Invisible Rulers, the people who turn lies into reality. And I'm wondering if you want to, like, is there a, when I saw that you were writing this book, knowing you as I have professionally for as long as I have, I was like, well, of course, this is a great title and this is exactly what she should be going after. But I'm curious for you, was there a turning point in your life, in your biography, where you sort of first clicked into this notion? I mean, what we've already been talking about, that this isn't just the lawyer on the courthouse steps trying to get the press to print what he has to say about his client, but there is, in fact, a system that does this. Well, like for you, what was your aha moment in realizing this?
So I started looking at opinion shaping starting in around 2014, 2013 timeframe. I was I opened the story talking about my experience as a mom who just had her first baby. The experience of when your Facebook feed completely changes. You have a baby. I imagine many people have had this experience. Facebook realizes it can market to you in entirely different ways. And so your feed changes and it begins to recommend all sorts of different types of content to you. Instagram is rather notorious for this. Also, you're sort of shunted into the mom content almost immediately. The mom influencers, are everywhere. The mom groups are everywhere. And, and for me at the time, this has changed a little bit because they began to realize how profoundly unethical this actually was. I was getting referred into anti-vaccine groups constantly. And I'm very, very pro-vaccine. I found this outrageous, actually. It really irritated me. So I created a fake account.
Were you in California at the time?
I was in California, yeah.
What the Venn diagram is that the algorithm picked up on.
Well, I made my own baby food. I breastfed for a year. I did some of the things that I think it probably keyed off of as being crunchy. I'm really not crunchy at all, actually. But I think, there were certain decisions that I made that I thought from an evidence-based perspective, I was, I was like, I can make my own baby food. It was really just economical. I was like, I don't want to pay for this. It's ridiculous.
Totally.
Like $4
It's
a
so
pouch.
funny that,
come on,
Yeah, you're like I love that you're like that you being evidence-based
like
as a mom
pragmatic,
is enough
actually.
to push you into this wackadoo anti-vax
That was actually
thing.
well because it there's some interesting reasoning there, right? One, I think the that notion of like do your own research is it became this sort of warped notion of people who did their research were actually getting referred into these communities that really very heavily focused on we don't trust what the establishment tells us, ergo here are groups where we're doing our research, by which they meant like sharing blog articles, really. Because I created another account just so I could join these groups and see what was happening in them. And what Facebook's algorithm really was keying off of there, this was at a time when it was very heavily trying to promote groups as a new way to keep people on site, to give you a brand new social graph. These are very, very highly active groups. People are really talking a lot within them as they are trying to figure things out, and also as they are highly activist, as they are highly opposed to sort of the mainstream and the kind of what we might consider to be sort of consensus opinion. And there is nothing like that on the other side. Most people who get their children vaccinated don't start groups to talk about it. There is no highly active pro-vaccine parent group because people just do the thing and then they go on with their lives. They don't start a group to talk about it. It is not a major event for them. And so there is no highly active group in which they are constantly sharing information and figuring out how to, wake up the sheep or anything like that. There is just that energy isn't there. So there is no highly activist community with many, many, many posts in it that would indicate to a relatively stupid algorithm, or an algorithm that is just keying off of activity and engagement, that this is something that it should be pushing to people. And so the reason I joined these groups was to try to get an understanding of like what was it about the dynamic and the structure and the engagement patterns that were making them something that was being recommended to people. That was my interest. So my experience there, though, just to kind of get back to your main question, was that this was really attracting people, in part because the algorithm was pushing it out, and in part because they were also paying to advertise these groups. So the people who ran the groups oftentimes had websites. So the owners of the groups, the kind of coordinators of the groups, had websites where they would monetize with ebooks, with supplements, with a variety of different types of products. and they would then pay money for Facebook ads that would push out stories like vaccines cause SIDS, which is not true, but these very kind of scary things that you see. You know, if you have a new baby, you spend the first year of your baby's life terrified that you're going to do something wrong.
Checking that
right?
they're checking them every night.
And
That's right.
yes, exactly. You put the little socks on their feet now. That, you know, the breathing monitors. You know, all sorts of different ways that you can, you know, try to not be one of those cautionary tales. And so you receive this ad targeting. It's a very scary thing to get, combined with seeing that there's 100,000 people in this group, and there is no counter group, right? There's no counter content. So this is what you're seeing. And so people join this group, and then they find community there also. They find a place to ask questions, and it's a very welcoming place. And so, you know, this combination of monetization and engagement and community provides people with something that they're looking for, and the realization that there is nothing like that on the other side was very alarming to me. And so I began to wonder what pushes back, what is the alternative